Right, so now we're being recorded. Thanks all for joining our webinar today on increasing transparency and accountability in protected and conserved area reporting. We have a fantastic group of speakers today. I'm Rachel Golden Kroner. I'm the co-chair, one of the co-chairs of the World Commission on Protected Areas Task Force on PAD, which stands for Protected Area Downgrading, Downsizing, and Degazettement. This is the first webinar that our task force is hosting, and so we're so excited to be here with you all today. We have some fantastic speakers, starting with Dr. Madhu, and then we'll have a talk by Dr. Carly Cook, as well as a talk by Dr. Harry Jonas, and then we'll have time for questions. So this is a really important topic because it follows on some prior work and expands it quite a lot that we've done. I'm going to advance my slides, that we've done on this concept of PAD, which is about legal changes that affect protected areas in different ways that temper restrictions, reduce boundaries, or remove protections overall. And we've actually started a new task force on this effort. So if you're interested in learning more about this task force, please pop in the chat your email address and I can follow up with you. But I also wanted to add that, not only is this phenomenon of legal changes that affect protected areas relevant to protected areas, but also relevant to conserved areas, right? This a critically important set of tools in the conservation toolbox that will help us get to 30 by 30 conserved areas or other effective area-based conservation measures. So to provide some additional context for this webinar and for this effort on tracking changes to protected and conserved areas, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Madhu, who is the chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas. Thank you so much for joining us from Mexico. We really appreciate it, and to say a few words about this work and passing it over to you.
Thanks, Rachel, and it's great to be here and to give the broader context and these opening remarks. So just by way of introduction, the World Commission on Protected Areas vision is that systems of protected and conserved areas are both effective in conserving nature and as such are recognized and valued both as cornerstones for conserving biodiversity and as natural solutions to global challenges, providing benefits to human well-being. Our mandate is technical. We develop and provide scientific and technical advice and policy guidance to a broad audience. Through the AEST reports, there is widespread scientific consensus that nature is in decline, and this has serious implications for human well-being. The ambition we see in Target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework to protect and conserve 30% of the Earth's freshwater, terrestrial, and marine ecosystems derives from this widespread recognition that we will need to move away from business as usual and take extraordinary measures to reverse declining trends. So a key aspect of Target 3 is not just the quantitative element, that is the expansion to 30%, but actually the qualitative elements. Quality of protection is as important as quantity, drawing attention to the importance of integrity of protected areas to ensure that they continue to secure the key biodiversity and ecosystem services values that they were initially established to protect. While IUCN recognizes 4 broad forms of governance, currently, the majority of areas reported to the World Database on Protected Areas are largely areas managed and governed by government agencies. If we want to make measurable progress towards Target 3, we will need to recognize and report on diverse governance and management regimes. And more importantly, we will need to ensure transparency in reporting on the status and integrity of area-based conservation measures. This webinar is going to touch on some of these very important issues that will need to be addressed as CBD parties and the broader conservation community comes together to ramp up implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. As Rachel has just said, we have an excellent panel of speakers lined up for this webinar. I think you're going to have a fabulous exchange of knowledge, and I think there are going to be some very interesting questions. I'm confident that we will all benefit hugely from this webinar. So thank you all for joining, and I wish this webinar all the very best. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Madhu. And yeah, thanks again for joining at a time in the afternoon, right after the steering committee meeting. So enjoy hopefully a good weekend. So now I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker rather, who's Dr. Carly Cook. Dr. Carly Cook is a researcher and an ARC Future Fellow at Monash University in Australia. She is an active member of the World Commission on Protected Areas. She's part of the task forces on PAD and conservation outcomes, and also a member of the expert assessment group for the Green List in Australia. And her research focuses on linking conservation science and practice with a particular focus on area-based conservation. So over to you, Carly.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll just share my slides. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along to this webinar on what I think is a really important topic in extending PAD to make sure that we're capturing changes to both protected and conserved areas. Just before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who they're the traditional owners on the land in which I live and work, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to thank my collaborators on this work, Dr. Rachel Golden-Kroner, and also Associate Professor Chris Lemieux, who's at Wilfrid Laurier University. So, tracking changes to conserved areas. I think everyone on this call is probably well aware of the motivation for the PAD framework. We know that protected areas lose protection in lots of different ways and for different reasons, and that those changes often are not transparent. And when there are so many protected areas, those changes can be really hard to identify and to monitor. And now that protected areas and the concept has been extended to the idea of conserved areas, or OECMs, we have a relatively new addition to our concept of area-based conservation. So, conserved areas, whilst they were part of the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2010, really only got a definition in 2018. And we're still learning how to identify these areas. So there's been some initial guidance provided in 2019, and a site level assessment tool was published in 2023. But we're still in the very early stages of actually recognising conserved areas. And with around 850 conserved areas in the World Database on OECMs across 9 countries, this is still a significantly smaller number than protected areas. But lots of countries are making rapid progress in this area in developing plans to recognise conserved areas. So now is a really good time to be thinking about how can we establish processes that are going to ensure transparency as we build the conserved areas around the world. And really, there's lots of unanswered questions about how to recognise conserved areas. And importantly, we're still grappling with the idea of what kind of mechanisms can be used to provide the governance and management structures that will underpin conserved areas. There's discussion around legal instruments, and there are some of those in place in some countries, ideas of binding agreements or using customary law, or other mechanisms that haven't really been fully explored yet. And there's also discussion around what sorts of areas should be a protected area versus a conserved area. And I highlight some of these uncertainties because they're particularly relevant to PAD and extending the PAD framework to conserved areas. So firstly, PAD requires some kind of documentary evidence of a legal change to have taken place in changing the protections. but there may not actually be a legal equivalent in terms of the evidence for conserved areas. So we need to be thinking about what kind of documentary evidence we might use in the context for conserved areas. And secondly, the difference between a protected area and a conserved area that has biodiversity as the primary objective could be a differences that may just be the result of the group managing the conserved area not wanting to be recognised as a protected area. Or for areas where conservation is a secondary management objective, this may interact with categories of protected areas where sustainable use is one of the key objectives. And so thinking about how these things might interact and whether maybe we might want to revisit some of the classifications around protected areas now that there's an expanded way to capture different management objectives. And I'll come back to this a little later. So there are lots of ways that protected areas and conserved areas might interact. And we saw a need for a framework that can capture the full range of changes that might occur in area-based conservation. But PAD doesn't necessarily perfectly translate to conserved areas. So this is where we introduce the idea of CAD, or protect or conserved area, downgrading, downsizing, and delisting. So first, conserved area downgrading. We define this as an increase in the human activities permitted within a conserved area that could be deemed incompatible with the in situ conservation of biodiversity. So this isn't a direct analogue of protected area downgrading because there's not necessarily legal restrictions in place for a conserved area. So we focus this on the human activities that are permitted and whether they're likely to be impacting on the biodiversity values of a site. And conserved areas do require some governance and management structures to be in place to control activities that could be incompatible with biodiversity conservation. And so there are still opportunities for us to be tracking the sorts of changes that might mirror the sorts of changes that take place with protected area downgrading. So there are some challenges around actually monitoring conserved area downgrading. It's not clear if or how the permitted activities might be documented, although I would note that section 3.2 of the site level assessment tool requests that the information be provided about the activities that are permitted. So this could be an opportunity for us to be tracking conserved area downgrading. But we also have questions around at what point does an activity negatively impact to the in situ conservation of biodiversity? And how will we actually monitor these changes if there's no legal or regulatory documents associated with these areas? And ultimately, we want to be able to understand why a change was made. And so how are we going to go about doing this? So there are lots of unanswered questions or challenges around how we're actually going to implement framework around conserved area downgrading. So next we have conserved area downsizing, and this really is a direct analogue of PAD. So conserved areas must be geographically defined spaces with their boundaries mapped. So any change to a boundary that excises part of a conserved area would be considered a downsize. So we define conserved area downsize as a decrease in the size of a conserved area as a result of the excision of land, freshwater, or sea area through a boundary change. So if we are able to include conserved areas in the World Database on OECNs, then potentially we can be identifying downsizing through changes in what's reported to the World Database. But like PAD, it's likely that these changes may also be identified by the conservation community, drawing people's attention to changes that are being made, and like the situation in Canada that we discussed in the paper associated with this work. And finally, conserved area downsize. When we're talking about challenges around conserved area downsizing, normally a downsize is independently verified through legal documents. That's not necessarily going to be the case with conserved area downsizing. Without legislation, a downsize may be difficult to detect if they're not being clearly reported through the WCPA, or if that's not being kept up to date, which we know is a challenge with PAD. And obviously we want to be understanding why these changes are being made and whether they're interacting with protected areas. So finally, we have conserved area delisting, which we define as an area that is no longer recognised as meeting the criteria for a conserved area. And we selected delisting rather than degazettement because there's not necessarily a legal gazettement process for a conserved area. But to be recognised, they should be being reported to the World Database on OECMs. So if an area is no longer recognised, then it should be removed from the database, at which point it would be considered to be delisted. And we see a couple of different pathways through which conserved areas might be delisted. So as I mentioned earlier, consent is from the landowners or those governing an area is essential to being recognised as a conserved area. So in which case, if a group removes their consent, then that area should be delisted. But there's also potential that a site may no longer meet the definition of a conserved area because its values have been degraded, or they fail to meet another criterion that's essential to be recognised as a conserved area. So in that case, we believe that conserved areas should also be delisted, and we would capture that through conserved area delisting. But a key challenge here is that we need to actually be monitoring sites and whether they continue to meet the necessary criteria to be recognised as conserved areas. And it's not clear that that's happening at the moment, and there would need to be some kind of ongoing process for us to be identifying sites that should be delisted. So I've highlighted some of the challenges we see with monitoring CAD. Who's going to be documenting and verifying the information needed to identify CAD events? What kind of monitoring is occurring to track the implementation of conserved areas over time? Who ensures that sites continue to meet the criteria to be recognised as conserved areas? And do we need different pathways to monitor CAD with different governance types? And I think particularly around Indigenous and local communities, how we would go about doing this and making sure that we're doing that in a sensitive way. And it's also really important for us to be capturing how protected and conserved areas may interact with one another. And so as part of this framework, we wanted to capture changes that might fall outside of PAD or CAD. And as part of this, we saw protected area conversions as a potential addition to this framework. So this would be a legally protected area that's converted to a legally conserved area. So PAD requires a legal change to take place, but conserved areas can have equivalent legal protections to protected areas. So if a protected area becomes a conserved area, it hasn't necessarily lost legal protection, but it's no longer a protected area, and so a degazettement has taken place. But we wanted to recognise these changes separately because they won't necessarily be picked up as a change in the area that's counted towards the Convention on Biological Diversity. So there needs to be real transparency around why these changes have taken place and whether a change is actually warranted. And sites need to genuinely meet the criteria to be recognised as conserved areas if they're going to be converted from a protected area to a conserved area. And then we see the reciprocal case of this through conserved area conversions, where a legally conserved area may be converted to a legally protected area. And so this would need to be in a situation where biodiversity is the primary management objective, in which case a conserved area could be gazetted and become a protected area. So in this case, there's been no change to the level of protection for biodiversity at a site, but an additional requirement on conserved areas to demonstrate biodiversity outcomes is not a requirement for protected areas. So it's really important that we track these changes too, because we don't want to see conserved areas that have become degraded being shuffled over to being protected areas. So we provided a framework that can capture the full suite of changes that could occur across area-based conservation. And we think that it's really important to have a framework like this so that we can ensure that any changes being made are being monitored. There may be totally legitimate reasons for countries to revisit the designations of protected areas, maybe in a situation where something should not have been recognised as a protected area and may be better to be recognised as a conserved area or more suitable for a conserved area. But we need systems in place to track these changes, and legal or regulatory processes can be really useful in documenting these processes. So we'd really like to see some kind of process that would enable us to track these changes. And we see that now is a really good time for us to be getting a framework like this in place and monitoring processes, getting those correct. Because there's potential for huge growth in the number of conserved areas being reported, and that's going to make monitoring much more challenging. So making sure that we have these systems in place, we can identify changes that are taking place and the underlying reasons for those changes, and making sure that, that those changes are warranted. So I'll leave it there and hand over to Harry. Stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Carly. And just for a means of housekeeping, thanks to those who I saw trickling in during Carly's talk. For questions, we will hold them until after Harry's talk. So if you have questions now that you'd like to just put down, there's a Q&A box. So please feel free to start using the Q&A box, and then we will have a discussion with both Carly and Harry after Harry's talk. So thank you. And now over to Harry Jonas, Dr. Harry Jonas. He is an international lawyer. He's the Senior Director of Conservation Areas at the World Wildlife Fund in the United States. And he co-chairs the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Specialist Group on OECMs, which there you see spelled out. And his work has led to 2 million square kilometers being identified and reported internationally as OECMs against the 30 by 30 target. So over to you, Harry. And I can't see or hear you yet, Harry. So I'm going to try and unmute you.
You can hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now and see you. Perfect.
Awesome.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, can you still see my screen?
Yes, can you put it in presentation mode?
Yeah, I'm just trying to do that. Thank you
Great.
so much. How's
All
that?
right.
Okay?
Perfect.
Cool. Thank you so much for that. I was just saying, yeah, thanks for that last bit, but how much of that area is currently being monitored? So I'm going to focus, the focus of this talk is on monitoring, but I am going to begin on how you identify sites, because I think if you get the identification part right and do that properly, and subsequently the reporting, the monitoring follows. So that's what I'm going to focus on. But before getting into the details for everybody on the line, I just want to remind people that there are a lot of thorny issues and details that we need to engage with 100% in this about OECMs. But the big picture for me, the highlight of this is that the framework really provides this opportunity to better identify, report, monitor, strengthen conservation beyond protected areas. If we get it right, that's what we can do. The reason we need to deal with the details is because there are some very thorny issues. There are some big questions, and we do need to get those right between now and 2030. The sooner the better. So before getting into the details, IUCN WCPA, we're promoting this overall framework. Everything that we do on OECMs should be rights-based. That's the foundation. But then you've got this kind of stepwise approach, which is we need enabling conditions to be in place in countries. We can then properly identify and report sites, monitor that we're talking about today. And then the all-important part for me, probably the point of doing all of this ultimately isn't so that we can, account and say we have or we haven't met 30 by 30 X or Y. It's really so that we can, through identifying these sites, we can then provide them better legal recognition, financial and non-financial forms of support, and defend them when they are threatened. It is about enabling us to know where these bright spots are and then support those bright spots, or even just get out of their way if that's all they actually need from us. So let me talk about identifying first. So IUCN WCPA has got at least these two resources. These are the two blockbusters, if you want to put it like that, on the left-hand side, guidelines to help you understand what is an OECM. On the right-hand side, what I will talk about just now, it's a relatively new published tool that can help you identify OECMs. There's a QR code if you'd like that. It's been translated and it's also downloadable. Rachel, you might do me a favor and find it online and drop that into the chat if that's possible
Sure.
on this interface. Thanks a lot. So there's just three key principles. And again, these key principles are important for identifying. They are equally important for monitoring. You identify things at the site level, not at system levels. You should always be rights-based, and the identification and ultimately the monitoring should be participatory, inclusive, involving all relevant actors. So right now I'm going to talk about the identifying part. When you use the tool, there are these three key steps, and the first is a screening tool. It's just the first step to help you understand, should I proceed with a full assessment or not? So at the screening step, you just apply two criteria. Is the site that we are looking at, maybe we're governing, if it's self-assessed, because you can do that as well. Is it within a protected area or not? And are there likely high biodiversity values? And if the answer to both those questions is it's outside of PA and it's likely that there are high biodiversity values, you can proceed. We intentionally, because of this focus we're putting on rights-based conservation, we actually made the second step a consent step. And so that is, if you are self-assessing, obviously you just need to note who within the governance authority has signed off on this, and that's been done properly within the governance authority. If it's external parties that are supporting a site to do the assessment, then there needs to have a full an FPIC process to make sure that everybody who should be providing consent has provided consent. Assuming that's been done, you then move to the full assessment. On the right-hand side, you can see the criteria that you'd apply. So is the site geographically defined, or do we know clearly what the boundaries are? We move from likely biodiversity values to confirmed biodiversity values based on various assessments you could conduct. is the governance and management of the site, is that resulting in the in situ conservation, and is that occurring over the long term? And are the equity considerations in place as well? Within that bundle, there are some things which we can provide very clear guidance on. There are still some issues that are being discussed, and the merits of different approaches are being discussed. One of the things I find so exciting about the OECM regime is that it isn't signed, sealed, and key issues fully agreed. As a broad group of people from around the world, there are at least 450 people in the specialist group and others who are engaging with these issues. It's just a really fertile place to be discussing inclusive, equitable, and effective conservation, basically. And so those of you on the line, some of you, I know it's wonderful working with you, and others, it's great that we are thinking this through together. I just wanted to show those of you who've never seen that document. It's challenging, friends, because on the one hand, these are very complex questions we're asking, but equally we need to make an assessment easily accessible to a whole range of different people who may be wanting to engage with the OECM framework. And so we walked a very difficult balance to try and balance between those two issues, basically. And it looks like this. If you open it up, this is one of the simpler ones, obviously. Criterion 3, the site should be geographically defined. And so we ask a very simple question. And then you can answer yes, uncertain, or partially, or no. And that is what it looks like for all the different criteria. And then you get to the final results. So if all your responses are positive, the site qualifies as an OECM and can be reported subject to any further consent that needs to be agreed. If there are some uncertain or partial responses in there, that could be very helpful to a site, because that may enable the governance authority of the site to identify, oh, if we were to improve on this or that, that will be a way to move from where we are to being qualifying as an OECM and being able to report and ideally get better support through that. And that I will come back to is where monitoring comes in. So monitoring systems are going to be all important for both of those, the first two, and then 3. If there are some no's, the site is not an OECM. It needs to, the CBD decision is quite clear that a site needs to meet all of those criteria to be an OECM. And of course, you can then decide which way you want to go, depending on how severe those no's are. So, yeah, and then as we say at the bottom there, you can then report that site. And Carly also mentioned the WD OECMs, World Database on OECMs. Importantly, that data can be reported by parties and non-state entities as well. And that's also going to be important for some of these questions about reporting that I'll get into just now. So, monitoring, sorry, I meant monitoring. So let's look at monitoring. What I want to do for you, actually, maybe just before I get into that, is just what I've got for you is 3 slides that I have drawn directly from CBD decision 14.8. And ultimately, whatever anybody says about OECMs, the only text which has been agreed internationally is the CBD decision itself, that's been agreed by all parties to the CBD. And negotiated hard and ultimately agreed by colleagues in the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and the NGO caucus and others as well. So what I wanted to do for you is I just pulled out some text from CBD decision 14.8 on monitoring to show you how seriously that decision takes the challenge of monitoring. And then I'll get into my final slide, looks at some kind of questions arising and some areas where we still need to do some work. So what you can see here is, I'm just going to let you read this actually, and then I'll speak to it. Yeah. So you can see that obviously when you are assessing, and identifying an OECM, you need to be very, very clear about the values, the various values of the site, and that can be done using scientific information, traditional knowledge, and other approaches. So it's both specific, but it's also plural about how one can get there, which I think is really, really important. I'll let you read this again, and then I'll speak to it again. So what I think is so interesting about the UN language here, this is a direct quote. I love the fact that they've simply said in the decision, monitoring the effectiveness of OECMs is needed. Not the most, elegant statement, but it's very clear. And then it basically provides you again, sort of, what we're looking for here and how you can get there, including baseline data, community monitoring, TK again, that monitoring needs to occur over the long term. And not just the ecological values, but also governance, stakeholder involvement, and management systems, which I think is great. It's super, super clear stuff. And this is the final time I'll do this, but I'll ask you to read this again. So you've got equity in there. There's a requirement for a monitoring system to inform management. And then the last part there is, I think, is really, really important as well. And that is saying it is important that OECMs be documented in a transparent manner. Exactly what that means is unsure, but it suggests to me that would require, being open, publishing somewhere, and or at least being open to providing information on sites when asked about the performance of sites. And I think that, for each one of these things that I've just mentioned, these requirements are intense. Some people have argued that the OECM requirements are higher standard than they are for protected areas. I actually don't think that's true, but I understand when people hear these kind of requirements that are set out in CBD decision 14.8, why they might make that argument. So I just want to draw on all of those to say it is pretty clear to me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts when we get together and discuss this just now, what you think of that. The CBD decision 14.8 is very, very clear about what is required. There are questions now about how we get there. So globally, there are lots of different tools. I just pulled a number out from our recent publication on this issue. There is a new IUCN WCPA publication. On the right-hand side, this is less than a week old, I believe, a framework for monitoring biodiversity in protected areas and OECMs, which is a very useful publication. Kudos to those authors. There are pre-existing tools that some people on this call will know and love, or know and not love so much, the MET and IMET. And also there are tools that focus on governance and equity produced by the International Institute for Environment Development, IIED, that they've branded as SAGE, GAPA, and SAPA to cover those key issues. So my last slide, friends, is that as I said at the very top of my presentation, the OECM framework is evolving. It's based on it's new, but it's based on all the existing conservation science and conservation approaches. Now, I think importantly, with much more of a social science approach and acknowledgement of indigenous peoples and local communities' contributions to conserving planet Earth. And so when in that framework, when you look at monitoring, a number of questions arise. These are the most frequently asked questions that I receive about monitoring, and you, I'm sure, have got your own. But okay, so a site has now been identified and it's been put into the world database. It's been reported to the world database on OECMs. Fantastic. When should it be monitored again? I mean, as in when should it be monitored, but when should that information be collected in a way that the site is essentially reassessed? What happens in the context of Carly and Rachel and colleagues' paper Chris Lemieux's paper, when a site is shown not to be conserving biodiversity What is the appropriate approach to that? Is it being delisted, or is it something else? Who in a country at a national level should be taking responsibility for these processes, or should someone at the national level take responsibility for these kinds of processes if that country is counting these areas against the 30 by 30 target? Importantly, a question which is always asked is, this sounds expensive. Who is going to pay for all this work? And so we need to take that very, very seriously. And lastly, there are some interesting examples arising around the world about how national governments and others can incentivize some of this work, including through tax breaks or loans that can be made to support these costs. These questions, and I'm sure the ones on your mind, friends, are critically important if we're going to make this work. And ultimately, for it to be robust, it's one thing if somebody stands up in 2030 and says, yeah, we made the target. It's another thing if many of us on this call are very skeptical of the sites that have been put into the system that have purportedly all added up to, quote unquote, hit that 30 by 30 target. So making it count is going to be super important. Rachel, back to you. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Harry, for teeing up some questions, some food for thought, some provocative pieces for us to consider. So for folks who have joined, and thanks to those who kind of joined and trickled in throughout, we're going to use the Q&A function for questions for both of our speakers. So please start adding those questions in there. And to kick it off, I'm going to start with a question for both of you to consider. And we probably won't have all the answers today, but just to kind of get this conversation started. So it sounds like we actually have some of the enabling environment. Harry, you mentioned the monitoring language in the CBD, and that it's actually pretty clear. And then we now have this framework for understanding one aspect of effectiveness. Changes to the CAD piece is one aspect, I would say, of monitoring effectiveness. So how can these come together? Because monitoring is only part of the story. We also have to think about reporting. So how do you think this enabling environment and this new science can actually come together for more transparency? Who would like to start with that one?
I'd love Carly to kick that off.
Well, I think there's opportunities for the way we report our OECMs to capture the sorts of activities that are permitted, because I think you flagged, Harry, that maybe delisting is not the way we want to go when sites are failing to meet the criteria, in which case we need some enabling conditions to help those sites lift their performance back to meeting the relative criteria. But I think we also don't want to undermine the approach to conserved areas by allowing sites that no longer meet the criteria to be considered conserved areas. If there's monitoring in place, then the potential to see the impacts on biodiversity of changes to the activities that are permitted, I think, would be really important, because we used the idea of human changes to human activities as a way to capture where changes might be equivalent to a downgrade, but that's actually quite a complex thing to identify. That would require changes to be having an impact on biodiversity, but not necessarily fully compromising those biodiversity values in the short term. But we do need that monitoring to be looking at whether those changes might compromise those values in the long term. So I think making sure that we have good systems to document the activities that are currently permitted. And I think in the site level assessment tool, it does ask for that information. So I think Rachel's right. We do have the potential for these enabling conditions for us to be monitoring these things, but making sure that that there is some accountability there, so that we don't end up in a situation where sites are being moved across from protected areas to conserved areas which, you know, we know could be appropriate. We think there are probably sites within the World Database on Protected Areas that are not, they don't meet the definition of a protected area. But if that is going to take place, there needs to be that transparency and accountability to make sure those sites are still meeting the definition for a conserved area. And, you know, we identified about 40% of the sites currently within the World Database on OECMs were originally, at least in part, a protected area. So there is this sort of revision going on, but it would be really great for us to have a way to identify when those changes take place. And those of us in the community have been trying to track PAD, understand just how difficult it can be to identify when a change has been made, and also understand the underlying processes behind that. So I think it would be really great if we could formalize some of these sort of enabling conditions, so we can really have that transparency and accountability, because we don't want to be casting doubt or, you know, pointing fingers or creating blame, but we do want a sort of an ecosystem that allows us to understand where these changes are taking place and why.
Yeah. Rachel, that's great. Thanks, Carly. Rachel, if I can answer your question in a slightly different way, I'd say, you know, friends, when I was describing the work that we did to develop the site level tool for identifying OECMs, and this balance between a document which was like, you know, very, very complicated, and something that was simpler and higher level, so that it could actually be used by sentient beings. Again, I think when we look at this challenge that, Carly, you've been describing around monitoring, it's going to be the same thing, because if you develop something which is, on the one hand, super rigorous, fantastic, you know, this is the absolute state-of-the-art, most rigorous, this is the highest possible bar for monitoring biodiversity and governance and management, and conservation outcomes, you know, in a site. Fantastic, that's great. But who is actually going to use that? And if that creates a barrier to entry, if people just aren't using it, and we know already in the protected areas world, with the funding available there or not in some places, the performance, then it fails, just because we've set the bar too high. So I think it's going to be super, you know, maybe what you actually require is sort of a number of different monitoring tools that are sort of like concentric circles. You know, if you can afford if you can afford to apply the following, then that would be the way forwards. That's the most rigorous, you know, level. And if you can do something else which is you know, lesser, but still allows you to measure at least one or two indicators, and 1, 2, 3, I think something along those lines. And I think especially working with our Indigenous colleagues and others, to make sure to, you know, so that they can create and co-create approaches, and we can kind of have a nested approach, is going to be important. Rachel, I just wanted to say, you know, the person who's put this, the question in the Q&A is Subir. And Subir and I have been backwards and forwards over the years. It's super nice to see you online. And he actually governs an OECM. It's either an OECM or it's a potential OECM in India. I know he's put the question in. I don't know if it's possible to allow him to speak to some of his experiences, because I think he'd bring a lot to the table, assuming it's the same Subir Chalfin.
Sure.
I'm not sure if it's possible, but just saying his question's a good one, but he also has got some experience on his site, and that would be super interesting to hear his views. Yeah.
Great. I'll see if we can unmute guests in the technical functionality, but in the meantime, if you could go ahead and take that question, Harry, I think that's probably best for you to take. So what metrics are recommended to measure and monitor diversity, so biological diversity in an OECM, for example, alpha, et cetera, abundance? Yeah.
I mean, Subir, I think the sense is that this is where you are asking the leading question, which we all need to figure out. There is basically, and it depends on of course, it depends on the the values that have been identified, and then how you're going to measure those. And I think that there are different schools of thought out there. I don't think there's one answer. So that would be my answer to your very good question. And if you could speak, I would like to ask you, what would work for your site, and what would be the most appropriate way forwards? What is feasible? That would be interesting. Has he got the mic? No, I think so. Go on, Subir, can we hear you? Subir, if you can hear me, just try one more time to say hi. We've got you off mute. Maybe not. That's a shame. But that would be my answer. My answer would be, what we really need to do now is listen to a lot of people like Subir and scientists and people who are governing authorities and others, and just say, what is the best, most practical way to do this? Yeah, but Rachel, back to you, and Carly as well, for your thoughts. Others, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, did you want to add something on that, Carly?
I was just thinking, the potential to identify major site values within an OECM, I think, could be really useful there. So I know within the guidelines, it recognizes biodiversity as a whole, with all of its supporting components. But if we were to look at OECMs through the lens of major site values, then I think monitoring would be much easier to achieve. We'd be able to target the things for which the site is really important. And I don't know whether that's a slight distortion of what's intended with OECMs, but if you think about the way the green list is implemented, sites are able to nominate their major site values, and then they can actually put in place performance indicators that would say, at this point, we believe we have achieved the conservation of our major site values. And that could be one way for us to target monitoring. That means that it's not overly onerous, but we can say this site is important for these reasons, and therefore we're going to design our monitoring program to focus on that.
Subir's saying he might be able to, he got the microphone back on or something. Can we just try him one more time, just in case? Otherwise, Subir, are you there now? Tentatively close, I feel. Oh, shame. Okay, another time. But it's voices like Subir's that we need to be listening to and taking seriously at this time.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Thanks both for that. And I'll round out with one last question. Let's see, looking at what folks have added as sort of pre-questions. So I guess, what do we see for the next steps for all this work? What would your ideal future look like over the next 6 years is that right? 6 years toward 2030? Not much time. How do you think we can best advance this ambition to better implement and understand progress toward OECMs?
Carly, after you.
Yeah.
Well, I guess as part of the work that we did, we were looking at the sites that are being recognized within the World Database on OECMs. And I think there's an opportunity to use case studies, maybe centering around the sites that have already been recognized through that database, to ask, what was the process through which that was achieved? And I think the opportunity to learn from case studies, because there's so much diversity, and the idea of OECMs is really very diverse, that I think using case studies and looking at what's already been reported, I would love to see there being some way to use the world databases to better track PAD and CAD. I think probably those of us who've engaged with that database have seen how challenging that can be. In some cases, we found sites that had been moved across databases where all of the information was the same, including the unique identifier. And in other cases, we found sites that had been split into multiple pieces, or pieces had been merged together. And in that case, you lose the ability to actually track, the changes that have been taking place. So I know that the World Database does not have a huge amount of resourcing, but I think if we could put some more effort into supporting the World Database to verify some of what's being put in place, and having systems to actually track changes associated with individual areas, maybe using that unique identifier to note when a change has been made, then it may really support us to both track PAD and CAD. So I would really like to see that being one opportunity moving forward.
And Harry.
Yeah, maybe just to add a final word is, I think once upon a time, OECMs was this ethereal idea, and it was, every time people wrote about it, it was OECMs should or could or might, this kind of thing. We're seeing there are a lot of actual experiences now. So I really think this next phase is bringing people who are working on governing OECMs, engaged with legislating for all of that kind of, those kind of people should be the new voice of what's happening, and really think through the practicalities of this. That would be key. Thanks.
Great. And it looks like we're just at time. So I would like to close and thank everyone for joining. I know people are up at different times of the day, morning, noon, and night. And we have this as a recording for those who can watch it later. So thanks to those who are watching this recording right now. So thanks so much to our speakers, to Dr. Madhu Rao, Dr. Carly Cook, Dr. Harry Jonas, and to our organizers. We had Renee Albrecht and Mitali Sharma from the WCPA task force. I want to especially thank them for all the work going into organizing this fantastic webinar. And thanks for your questions and comments. If you'd like to get in touch, I'll actually just put my email here. How about that? If you're interested in the PAD task force, I would love if you're interested to reach out and become a part of that. Please go ahead and just copy down my email, and let's get in touch. So with that, thank you, and have a great rest of your day, and to the success of OECMs. Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Rachel, for hosting.